I had hoped originally that I would be able simply to deliver the lecture and not have to read it. However, I've got so much I want to say that in order not to keep you here 2.5 hours, I need to stick close to a manuscript. So please forgive me if I'm a little less free than I would like. No less than 26 times in the 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah is Yahweh identified as the Holy One of Israel. Yet, there is not one reference to God's holiness in the entire book of Genesis. Words related to the concept of holiness appear only twice, and there is no reference at all to the holiness of God. Why is this? Since the Bible doesn't actually answer that question, if we would do so, it must necessarily be with some caution. But with that in mind, I suggest there are two reasons for the absence. First of all, the term holy had become devalued in the common usage of the day. It merely referred to the separateness of the gods. It denotes that they are set apart from the common or ordinary. Interestingly, it's not used very much of the gods themselves, but more often of that which pertains to them. So, for God to have described himself to Abram as being holy may not have elicited much more than a ho-hum response. What else is new, he might have said. No, the problem Abram would have had with this God who was speaking to him would not have been God's holiness. The problem would be a lot deeper than that, requiring Yahweh to start a lot farther back with Abram than with his holiness. For if the patriarch may have taken it for granted that God is holy, he certainly would not have taken it for granted that God is trustworthy. Trustworthiness is not a trait that can be applied to a God. That conviction extends all the way back to the Garden of Eden. God, the serpent told our first parents, is playing his own game and will not hesitate to abuse us and lie to us for the sake of winning that game. Having bought that lie, it's no wonder that Adam and Eve's children soon began to conceive of all of reality in a diseased way. To make the gods more controllable, they began to see them as nothing but an extension of themselves, with the result that while the gods are sometimes more trustworthy than we, they're even more likely to be less trustworthy than we. This presented Yahweh, the one true God, with a serious problem. He could not achieve his fundamental purpose in creating the human race unless he could prove himself trustworthy. Why is that? In order to answer the question, we must ask what that fundamental purpose of God is. It is that we should be in an intimate, personal relationship with him, whereby his image in us could come to its full potential. And such a relationship is impossible without mutual trust. But is that God's purpose? A statement as prestigious as the Westminster Confession simply says that our purpose is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. There's none of that relationship and image language to be found in that venerable creed. Now, without taking anything away from the authors of that confession, I'd like to go to a somewhat more venerable document than that, the New Testament. We might go to Paul, from whom we read, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight," Ephesians 1:4. Or, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do," Ephesians 2:10. Or, "That you may be filled to all the measure of the fullness of God," Ephesians 3:19. Or, "Therefore, be imitators of God and walk in love as Christ also has loved us," Ephesians 5:1 and 2. Alternatively, we might turn to Peter, to a passage that our president has been reminding us of. Through these he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them, now get this, you may participate in the divine nature and escape the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. 2 Peter 1:4. Or we could go behind Peter and Paul to Jesus, who told us, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. Whoever has my commands and obeys them, he's the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. But I want to go behind even Jesus and the apostles. Not because I think there is a greater authority than they, but in order to show you that their point of view is not a later interpretation imposed on the Word of God by some new dispensation. No, what Jesus and the apostles say is nothing other than what the text had been saying from the outset. So come with me to Genesis 17:1, a statement that seems to me more and more programmatic. That is, a statement that shapes all that follows it. Remember the setting. God had come to Abram and Sarai with some sweeping promises of land, children, and an enduring name. While it was necessary for the couple to launch out into the unknown, leaving the familiar and the known, in order to receive those promises, God did not ask for any personal commitment of themselves to him. That's for later. When they did launch out in that first step of trust, they gave Yahweh a whole host of opportunities to demonstrate his trustworthiness. Thus, when God raised the stakes 10 or 11 years later and announced that he intended to give Abram and Sarai not one descendant, but millions, it was not out of the realm of reason for an Abram who had learned how trustworthy God is to believe that astounding statement. But still, there was no demand on God's part for personal commitment from the couple who were to become Abraham and Sarah. Where the invitation to the first of such commitments is found is after the tragedy that sprang from that great promise in Genesis 15. For Abraham and Sarah took it upon themselves to fulfill God's promise for themselves in their own understanding and in their own strength. The result was Ishmael, and the world still suffers today because of that bad choice. Between Ishmael's birth at the end of chapter 16 and the opening verses of chapter 17, there are 13 years of silence. What may or may not have transpired between Abraham and Yahweh during those 13 years, we are not to know. But now, 13 years after the tragedy, God comes to Abraham with an even more developed statement of his promises. God had proven in a myriad of ways he is not like the gods, that the serpent had lied, that he can be trusted. He wants to give himself and his gifts to us even while we are yet maintaining our lofty independence. But not forever. We were made for committed relationship with our Creator, and he is not going to leave us in our deadly aloneness. So the hour has finally come for Abraham to make his first personal commitment to God, a commitment that will be symbolized by the act of circumcision. And that act is deeply symbolic, not only because of what had taken place in the previous chapter between Abraham and Hagar, but as a more general symbol of the surrender of one's right to dominate, to control, to stamp the world with one's own image. By this act, one is giving up that right and instead giving God the right to stamp his image, not upon the male reproductive member, but on the proud and stubborn human heart, male and female alike. That's the background. Now we come back to that deceptively simple injunction with which God introduces this incident. Walk before me and be tamim. The King James Version translated that Hebrew word with the English word perfect. Walk before me and be perfect. Modern translations, reflecting our deepening cynicism concerning any possible perfecting of the human, normally opt for some other word, such as blameless. This, of course, can be made to accord very well with the Reformation idea of justification, suggesting that we can be deeply blameworthy at the same time that we are legally declared to be blameless. But the common usage of tamim in the Bible refers to anything but a subjective or a judicial quality. It is describing a fully objective condition, that of a sacrificial animal, specifying that the animal must be whole, complete, without defects of any kind. It must be all that could reasonably be expected of any animal of that type. So, what is God meaning to convey to Abraham when he speaks to him in those terms? He is saying that if Abraham will enter into an ongoing relationship with God, a walk, Abraham may become all that a human being was ever meant to be. This is precisely what Christ had in mind when he said to a couple of fishermen at their boat or to a tax collector at his table, "Come, follow me." He was calling them into a relationship whereby they could grow up as human beings, whereby they could become just what the Creator designed us to be, that is, persons in whom the image of God is fully developed. Persons who are indwelt by the Father, just as the Father dwells in Christ. So, why does the holiness of God not appear in Genesis? Because before he could talk about the character that he made us for, his own character, he had to convince us that he could be trusted, that he was quite unlike the deities we had made in our own image. In 3 different scenarios in the book of Genesis, he makes this point. In the case of Abraham, he established that he intends to bless his creatures, and that blessing is available to all those who will trust, believe, and obey him. In the life of Jacob, he showed that he is trustworthy even when we will not initially trust him, when we try to manipulate the situation to procure blessing for ourselves. However, he goes on to show that in the end, his blessing is only available to those who abandon that attempt to manipulate the world and give their destiny unreservedly into his hand. Finally, with Joseph, he proves that he can be trusted to accomplish his good purposes even when all the circumstances of life seem stacked against it. By the time we've reached the end of the book, if we will not accept that this God has our best interests at heart and can be trusted and believed and obeyed, there really is nothing more that can be said. We're either ready to move on in the process or we're not. And if we're not, it's hard to imagine what more could be said to bring us to that point. But why is this walk, this process of deepening committed relationship, necessary in order for us to become tamim, If we are made in the image of God, as Genesis 1:27 so explicitly states, why should not that image simply shine out of us in a more progressive way, just as we progressively grow into physical adulthood? What is it which prevents us from growing into tamim? The answer to that question is found very early in the book of Genesis, in a statement that is at least as programmatic as Genesis 17:1. In this study for this lecture, I've become more convinced of that. That statement is found in Genesis 6:5, where we're told that God recognized that the yetzer of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Wow. Remember that the heart in the Bible is the core of the personality. It is the center of thought, as this verse clearly states, but also of the affections and of the will. The Hebrews, rightly I think, do not admit any division of the personality into discrete functions. While our thinking, feeling, and willing may be examined separately for purposes of analysis and discussion, they cannot be separated in fact. Now, this passage says that not only is our thinking corrupted extensively, the whole race, in all times and all places, it is also corrupted intensively. In this regard, that word yetzer is very interesting. Its verbal root is used of the action of a potter as he shapes the clay on the wheel. Thus, this noun could here be translated as the shape of our thoughts or the frame of our mind. In that light, it is most interesting to see how the King James Version translators translated the term. They said, the imaginations of the thoughts of their heart. Other translations are every inclination of the thoughts of his heart, NIV and NRSV. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart, ESV. Their every thought and inclination, REB. Everything they thought or imagined, NLT. And the Jewish Publication Society, every plan devised by his mind. Hebrew students ask me about that in class. What all of these are struggling to convey is that the capacity for imaging and thus imagining, which seems to be uniquely human, has become utterly perverted. Instead of being used in the service of tov, or good, that is, God's creation purposes, this amazing faculty of imaging is now thoroughly turned to the accomplishment of ra, evil, that which is contrary to God's creation purposes. The very way we go about shaping the things which our minds devise is always and continually for ra, evil. We may think that this is somewhat exaggerated, however. Surely, sometimes the plans we form are for good, but are they? What is this evil imagination, as the rabbis call it? One of the most helpful statements on this subject I have ever seen comes from Oswalt Chambers. He says this: the disposition of sin is not immorality and wrongdoing, but the disposition of self-realization. I am my own God. This disposition may work itself out in decorous morality or in indecorous immorality, but it has the one basis: my claim to my right to myself. Chambers is saying that the only good thing I can do, The only thing that will put me in line with God's creation purposes is to relinquish my claim to my right to myself. Apart from that, even the most decorously moral things I may do are not good, but evil. Apart from that relinquishment, all the imaging of my heart is to the wrong purpose, the achievement of my will. And regardless of how that may appear, it is not good. The first occurrence of this phrase, the imaginations of the thoughts of their hearts, is at the beginning of the Noah narrative. And it leads us into one possible approach to solving the problem. If it's true that the sinful disposition has affected the whole human race both extensively and intensively, then one approach might be to remove all the bad actors from the gene pool, leaving only the good actors. These good actors would be those who are not living out their disposition, but are genuinely living for God as God has defined it. Perhaps, if we could wipe out all the rest and start the human race over again with only these people, they would not pass on this evil imagination to their children. But are there such people? Well, wonderfully, in this case, there was one. Noah, a righteous man who was tamim in all his generations, who habitually walked with God. The connection between this statement and that of 17:1 is obvious. Unfortunately, as God knew, and as events were to demonstrate, this approach would not solve the problem. One individual who is living out the image of God, whose own imaging is thus consistently for good, cannot pass this trait on to his or her children. This is what the flood teaches us. It's clear after the flood in the incident in which Ham used the childish behavior of his father under the influence of alcohol to diminish his father and exalt himself. But even prior to that, we have God's own statement where he says he will not destroy the earth again because the way humans shape the thoughts of their hearts is evil from their childhood. God has shown us if we think that solution might work, it's useless. There's no point in destroying the earth again. The point has been made. In other words, destroying the bad actors and trying to build a world out of good actors will not solve the problem. I'd like to spend some time there, but we don't have time. The disposition of sin lies beneath the matters of example and instruction. If there is to be a major shift away from this disposition for a large number of Earth's population, then the solution will have to work on a much deeper level than mere behavior. So when we come to the end of the book of Genesis, three things have been made absolutely clear. Number one, the absolute trustworthiness of God. He cares about our good before he cares about his own. Number two, God's general goal for us, that his image in us might be brought to its full flower. And three, the seemingly intractable nature of the sin problem preventing the achievement of this goal. With these issues clarified, God is ready to move on in his revelational program, and it is thus that we come to Exodus 3. When Moses goes to investigate this bush that burns without being consumed, a voice from within it calls his name. And when Moses responds, the voice issues a remarkable command. Don't come any closer, but take your shoes off, because you're standing on holy ground. What makes this command remarkable is that it is clear this is no shrine which has been hallowed by ritual and worship. This ground is holy for one reason only: the holiness of the one who is speaking from the bush. So powerful is his holiness that anything associated with him, though it be as common as dirt, is instantly contaminated with that holiness. Then, when Yahweh, whom Moses does not yet know by that name, informs Moses that he is the God of Moses' ancestors, Moses falls on his face, afraid to look at God. Now, at least two questions present themselves to us out of this narrative. The first one is, why does God begin by making an issue of his holiness? After all, he didn't with Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph. Why now and why here? The second question has to do with Moses' response. Moses falls on his face, which, by the way, is usually translated worship. The correct posture of worship: on your face. Again, I'd like to talk about that, but I won't. Moses falls on his face after this Holy One has identified himself as the God of Moses' ancestors. None of the ancestors had fallen down in this God's presence. Although it is true, Jacob spoke a bit wonderingly about still being alive after he'd seen the face of God. But here, Moses' instant response is terror. What's going on? Can it be that he has suddenly put two and two together? Who is this God who had supper with Abraham, who wrestled with Jacob, who made Joseph such a success in Egyptian slavery? Who was this local family God with whom the Abraham tribe had become so familiar? Was he the Holy One? Not a Holy One, but the Holy One? I suspect it's thoughts like those which went crashing through Moses' head at this moment. It is as though one discovers that those wires in the wall that one has been handling so casually while connecting them to the outlet were live. That'll send a shiver down your spine. But what about the first question? Why does God make a point of his holiness at this place and at this spot in the narrative? We come back again to the issue. What is God about? What is he seeking to bring about? He is taking his people and us toward the lasting solution to our sin problem. He is seeking to deal with the evil imagination that prevents us from becoming tamim, whole. But what does this have to do with holiness? Good question. Here at the outset of the narrative that will culminate in the Mosaic covenant, on the very Mount Sinai where the covenant will be made, God chooses to begin by emphasizing his holiness. He is making it clear that he will not make it possible for us to walk with him by somehow diminishing his essential godhood. If we are to walk with him, then somehow we're going to have to take off our shoes and walk on his ground. It is no accident that some 42 years later, at the end of this entire sequence, as Joshua is about to lead his people against Jericho, the first of God's gifts in the promised land, Yahweh's word is precisely the same. Take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground. What a thought. We are going to be raised to the level of God rather than in paganism bringing the gods down to our level. This idea is re-emphasized at a second critical place in the narrative. The people have now come, as Yahweh had earlier promised Moses they would, to the foot of Sinai. There, Yahweh further reveals his purpose in all of this. If the people will trust him enough to enter into and keep his covenant, they will become a royal priesthood, a holy nation. By committing themselves to God in a covenant, they will become much more than merely his holy people, set apart by reason of belonging to a God. No, Yahweh is going to do something with them and in them which will involve them in his work in the world. They will become his priests. They are not merely going to be delivered from their problem, but are going to become vital instruments in the solution of the problem for the world. And to do so, they are going to partake of the most essential character of God, his holiness. This is further underlined for them when God says to them in Exodus 22:31, at the conclusion of a detailed statement about relating to God and to others, "You must be holy men to me." Is that at this point I must say a word about this concept of the holy and the strange thing that happens to it in the biblical context. Perhaps one of the most famous books on this subject, certainly the most famous in the 20th century, was Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy. In that book, Otto describes holiness in terms that would be fully comprehensible to most of the people in the ancient Near East. He describes it in terms of awe, of fear, of wonder, of that which defies explanation or categorization. He uses a number of terms and phrases that have become somewhat standard in the field, like mysterium tremendum. But there's one phrase in particular that captures correctly the broadest sense of this concept: the holy other. W-H-O-L-L-Y. The holy other. What is holiness about? It is about being radically other. Holiness is thus the central descriptor of deity, encompassing any and all of the divine attributes. Thus far we can go with Otto. But the odd thing about the book is that it stops short. For he writes his book as though the Old Testament did not exist. And he cannot do that if he means to fully define the concept, for something happens in the Old Testament that radically reshapes our understanding of holiness. That reshaping concerns the moral qualities of holiness. To be sure, Otto's description of holiness conforms to what it was among Israel's neighbors. That is, it expressed the otherness of the gods and the certain feeling of eeriness one has in the presence of the other than normal, but without any reference to moral qualities. Given that polytheistic setting, Otto is exactly right. Of course there can be no moral content to holiness in a polytheistic setting. Not only are the good gods, the clean gods, the beneficent gods holy, but so are the evil gods, the unclean gods, and the maleficent gods. So how is it that in modern English dictionary, one definition of the word holy is moral rectitude or purity? Something Otto completely omits. The answer is fairly simple. There is only one being in the universe who is wholly other. The gods have no real right to that term at all, for they are simply the forces of this world with masks on. The dripping sarcasm of the prophets in regard to the idols captures this truth vividly. And this is exactly the understanding Moses betrays in his famous Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, after Yahweh's mighty acts of deliverance culminated in the crossing of the sea. There Moses sings, "Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them." And I suspect that the them here is not only the Egyptian army, but also the Egyptian gods. It was not only the Egyptian army that went down into the depths of the earth, but also the gods upon which the Egyptians had relied and which they had dared to call holy. So what does it mean if there is only one holy being in the universe? It means there is only one holy character, His. So, follow me here. If the Holy One had been cruel or vicious or greedy or tyrannical, that's what holy would mean in our English dictionaries today. To be holy is to be a tyrant, because the Holy One is a tyrant. But thank God it's not true. The Holy One is love. He is faithfulness, truth. He is compassion. He is patience. This is the meaning of that passage in the Old Testament that is the most quoted passage by the rest of the Old Testament. Exodus 34:6. Yahweh, Yahweh, God of tenderness and compassion, slow to get angry, full of undying love and faithfulness, keeping His undying love to thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. This is who the Holy One is. This is what holy character consists of. And how strange that Rudolf Otto would not say one word about this amazing truth. Now, an important point needs to be made in this regard. There are those today who seem to be saying that holiness is to be subsumed under love, or to be reduced to an adjective modifying love, as in holy love, as though holiness were but one of the attributes of God, and a lesser one at that. This is both historically and linguistically incorrect. God's holiness is His fundamental otherness. To that extent, Otto is absolutely correct. Holiness is not one of the divine attributes. Holiness is the box in which all else that God is contained. If Yahweh is the one truly transcendent being in the universe and is not love, He is still holy. But praise be to God, the actual content of the holiness of the one transcendent Creator is love. Nevertheless, holiness is not to be subsumed under love or even paralleled to it. On this point, note that in the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, God is defined as holy in three important places. The cry of the four living creatures around the throne, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come, Revelation 4:8. The cry of the martyrs under the altar, how long, O Lord, holy and true, 6:10. And the song of the Lamb in Revelation 15, where it says, who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name, for you alone are holy. In contrast, there is no place in this final biblical statement where God is defined as love. I do not make these points to suggest that Yahweh is anything other than love, but to say that a misreading of the Scripture's statements about the foundational nature of holiness is ultimately to do a disservice to love. For if there is a God who is love, but before that is not holy, that love is worthless. But there's another way that we know the character of the Holy One besides such a statement as Exodus 34:6 and others like it. And this is in the further content of the covenant, which is found after the book of the covenant in Exodus 20 to 24. To this point, Exodus 24, there have appeared a grand total of 9 occurrences of all forms of the word holy in the Bible. from Genesis 1 to Exodus 24, 9 occurrences of any form of the word. Now, between Exodus 25:1 and Numbers 10, when 11 months later the Israelites set out for the promised land, there are no less than 170 occurrences. Should we think that some sort of a point is being made? Certainly we should. But what's the point? Notice what immediately follows upon the giving of the covenant, concluded in Exodus 24. It is the building of the holy tabernacle with all its holy furnishings, where a variety of holy offerings are given by its holy priests, the chief of whom wears a medallion on his forehead inscribed with the words, "Holiness to the Lord." And when the two eldest sons of the high priest decide that God can be served in the way they choose, rather than the way he chooses, according to the imaginations of the thoughts of their hearts, and they die, what is it Moses says, speaking for God? By those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified. And a few verses later, he says that the priests are not to drink intoxicating liquor in connection with their service in the tabernacle, because their duty is to distinguish between the holy and the unholy, a distinction which Nadab and Abihu surely did not think was very significant. Now, what's all this saying? It is saying that the goal of the covenant itself in Exodus 20 to 24. But what's the goal of the covenant in 25 through 40? An intimate relationship with the holy God. A relationship that will not be realized because we drag the Holy One down to our level, as Nadab and Abihu tried to do, and indeed all human religion tries to do, but because we allow him to raise us to his level. But what is the content of this relationship, this living in the tabernacle of his presence, or as Hebrews says, the tabernacle of his face, this walk with God? It is, as Leviticus 19 to 21 makes crystal clear, to be holy as God is holy. But what's that? It's not to be transcendent, not to be wholly other, for the only one who can say that is the I am. Neither is it, as I have said above, merely to be set apart from the common for God's use. So what is it? It is to replicate the character of God in our relationships with others. Leviticus 19:2 sets the stage. You shall be holy, because I, Yahweh your God, am holy. Then there follows a variegated collection of commandments, ranging from honoring your father and mother, to eating the entire peace offering in one day, to not cutting the grain in the corners of your field so the poor can get to it, to not stealing, to not being partial in legal judgments, to not hating your brother in your heart, but rather loving your neighbor as yourself, and on and on and on. Peppered throughout the collection is the reminder, I am Yahweh. Wondering why you're supposed to do this? I am Yahweh. Or sometimes expanded, I am Yahweh your God. You're living this way because of who I am and your relationship to me. In other words, holiness is profoundly ethical. Because Yahweh is profoundly ethical. He does not treat other persons as objects, and therefore neither can we. He prefers others to himself, and we must as well if we belong to him. Every one of our choices concerning God's world and his people must reflect his holy character. But we need to be careful at this point. It's easy to say these things are holy because they're right and good, as though these actions determine the nature of holiness. That's not true. These actions are an expression of the holy character of God, and that's what makes them right and good. This is why the section, chapters 19 to 22 of Leviticus, ends as it does. Therefore, you shall keep my commandments and perform them. I am Yahweh. You shall not profane my holy name by your lousy living. But I will be made holy among the children of Israel. You decide whether God is holy in the eyes of the world or not. I am Yahweh who makes you holy, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh. If there were any question that this fundamental change in the way we view ourselves, other people, and the world is God's intent, that question should be laid to rest by the closing of the Pentateuch, where Moses sums it all up in Deuteronomy 26:19, using some of the very same unusual terms that occurred in Exodus 19 at the beginning of the covenant. Today, you have proclaimed Yahweh to be your God, and that you will walk in all his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments, and his regulations, and that you will listen to his voice, which in Hebrew means obey. Also today, so that's what you've proclaimed. He's my God. I'm going to walk in his ways. I'm going to do what he says. Also today, the Lord has proclaimed that you are his special treasure, just as he promised you would be if you would keep his commandments, and that he will set you high above all the nations which he has made in praise and in name and in honor. So you will be a nation that is holy to Yahweh your God, just as he promised. Now, where does all this bring us? We've been seeking to answer the question implicit in Genesis 17:1. What does it mean to be a tamim sort of human being? A perfect, fully realized, whole human being. One who is all that a child of God, made in the image of God, could be expected to be. The answer to the question, as we have seen, is that in some manner we should replicate the holy character of God, not forensically, but in fact. When his image is expressing itself in our lives, we will think as he thinks, react as he reacts, treat things and others as he treats them. In short, walk as he walks in love. Only in this way can the way we form the thoughts of our hearts be fundamentally altered. Now, to be sure, we have not come to the end of the story when we come to the end of Deuteronomy. Although we now see clearly what the solution to our dispositional problem will involve, we do not yet, as a whole people, have the means of implementing that solution. The third occurrence of the term Yetzer is very significant in that regard. It's found near the end of Deuteronomy. There Moses says that the reason he is singing his song of the future, recorded in Deuteronomy 32, is because he knows the Yetzer that informs the behavior of the people and will cause them to corrupt their way in later times. When they do, he says, his song will stand as a testimony against them, witnessing that the consequences that are befalling them are none other than those they brought upon themselves. Thus, just as the flood did not solve the dispositional problem, neither does the covenant in and of itself. It points the way to the holy character of God, but the way itself lies in the future. This is so because the covenant does not have in itself the means to defeat the evil imagination, what Paul will later call the flesh. In some ways, the revelation of the covenant only heightens our frustration because now we see what life outside the pit could look like while we are yet unable to get out of the pit. That is what Paul is describing in Romans 7, the experience of every good Israelite, with a few exceptions. The Israelites, or we, if we're to get beyond that point, then the same thing will have to happen to all of us that happened to a representative few in the Old Testament. There will have to be an infusion of the divine Spirit to cleanse and empower the divine image in us. When that happens, the aspirations David describes in Psalm 101 may become a reality for any of us. Here's the Living Oswalt version of Psalm 101. Oh, let me sing of undying love and perfect order. To you, O Yahweh, let me make melody. I want to be careful to walk in a perfect tamim way. When will you come to me? I will walk around with a perfect heart in the midst of my house. I will not put any perverse thing in front of me, even if it's on a computer. I hate those who do treacherous things. They shall not cling to me. May he who has a perverse heart be taken away from me. I will not know evil. As for the one who slanders his fellow in secret, him I will silence. As for the haughty and arrogant man, him I cannot stand. I will look for the faithful in the land, those who are true, to live with me. It's the one who walks in a perfect way who will serve me. Someone who is deceitful will not live in my house, nor will I pay attention to the one who speaks lies. At the beginning of the day, I will silence all the wicked in the land, so as to cut off from the city of Yahweh all those who do iniquity. But the mechanism for that realization is the subject of another lecture. Here my goal has been to lay the Old Testament foundations for our topic. I've sought to answer the questions pertaining to God's purpose for human life, the reason why that purpose is frustrated, why holiness is a relative latecomer on the scene, and is yet central to God's entire enterprise.